Well, welcome back for part two of the Skinnerman story. I'm going to try to make these videos a little bit longer because not everybody has a short attention span like myself. So bear with me. I tend to ramble. As I was saying, I was in Savannah, Georgia, mid 80s, and, curious about a series of local child murders that were being blamed on a local man, well, young man. They were accusing him of being a werewolf or a wolf like monster or a cursed man. Um, so naturally, I want to go find out more about it. And that's how I discovered and first heard the name Skinnerman. Is during the course of his investigation. Um, wasn't a formal investigation. I was by myself. It was clearly me um, being curious to see if it was real or not, and not total bullshit. But that story is for another day. We're talking about the Skinner Man right now. Well, I managed to talk to some of the relatives of one of the little girls. She was 13 when she was murdered. One of the little girls, their family, they lived in an old ramshackle house that was near an old plantation house that had fallen into, an old antebellum house had fallen into disrepute. But they had set up their shack on the back lawn of it, and they lived there. And as I was asking them questions, just out of curiosity, I, of course, offered my condolences and asked them if he had heard anything. And one of their, um, one of the little boys who lived in the house, he walked up behind the mama and the daddy, and he grabbed my arm and looked up at me. He says, "Don't worry, Mister Skinner Man's going to take care of him." Talking about the man who'd been arrested um, for the murder of, the little girl. And I looked down at him and said, "Skinner Man," popped right out of my mouth. And both the mama and the daddy whirled on him and told him to, quote unquote, get his ass back inside the house and shut up about that nonsense. Which, of course, piqued my curiosity even more about the Skinner Man. I had forgotten about the werewolf. I wanted to find out about the Skinner Man. So when they finally turned back around, I looked at him and said, "What is he talking about? What's the Skinner Man?" And they told me that was that was something that was better left alone, and that it was none of my business. I wasn't from there, and there was no need to know that. Well, that was a huge mistake because I want to know about it even more. Then, if you tell me I shouldn't know something, I want to know something more about it. So when I left there, um, I took the supposed werewolf killings and stuck them in the back of my head and filed them again to investigate later. And I wanted to find out more about the Skinner Man. So, of course, I go into Savannah. Remember, back in the mid 80s, this is before Savannah, Georgia had its renaissance. And Savannah was not as beautiful as it is now. If you go down to visit as a tourist, it was pretty seedy. It was pretty dangerous to go there. It wasn't as beautiful. It had its own charm about it. But Savannah was wild and dangerous. There was a local hoodoo shop that was right off the square. If you've ever been to Savannah, you know what I'm talking about. That was right off the northern squares in the center of Savannah, downtown Savannah. And for those of you who don't know, um, hoodoo, as with an H, not a V, is not a religion. It's a combination of um, folk medicine, witchcraft, old school paganism, mountain worship, mountain, not worshiping the mountain, but um, spirits, the natural world, um, mainly revolving around cursings and blessings. Hoodoo is, and healing, but it can be used for all kinds of things. But hoodoo is not a religion, not like voodoo is. Voodoo is a completely different subject, and it's a religion. A hoodoo worker you would go to help heal a child who you think the neighbor made sick with the evil eye, or to curse a neighbor who you believe has more than they should have, or you figure it has wronged you. Um, Hoodoo practitioners are mainly female. They're found throughout the South, um, in the more wild and rural areas of the South and in the mountainsides. Hoodoo practitioners are very well read, um, and up to date on what's going on in their community and with the people around them. They do not offer their services for free. They always have when you ask them to do something, they always have a cost. You got to pay something up front, whether it's in money or livestock or, God's forbid, blood, which that's another story for another time. So I went to one of the local hoodoo shops there. They had a pretty good reputation, which was a series of ladies who were selling their wares. And I went there to find out the meaning of the name Skinnerman. I wish I hadn't, now that I think about it. This is before I found my faith in the voodoo religion. These women scared the shit out of me. And up to that point, there was very few things in this world I figured that could scare me. But these ladies scared me to death. Yeah, sorry, had a flashback right there. Let's get back to the story. So I went to the shop, and of course they didn't want to talk to me unless I, bought something. So I bought a few charms and a few trinkets, and as with most hoodoo storefronts, the people who run the storefront are not the people who are the actual practitioners. It's usually an older member of their family, an older matron of the family that runs the whole show. So I managed to buy enough merchandise and give them enough money to introduce me to the matriarch of the hoodoo family. And I was able to go out to their house to meet her, which was even spookier. If you've ever seen the movie or read the book on the Garden of Good and Evil, that statue that's in the middle of the swamp, that's still there, that you can go now to Savannah and they'll take you out and show it to you. They didn't live far from that statue. They were swamp people. They lived deep in the woods out there with the alligators and cottonmouths. So as I approached the house with a guide from the family, which of course I had to pay for to get them to bring me out there. At that point, I was, writing checks and cashing them at the local drugstore to get some quick cash really quick to be able to pay these people to find out what I wanted to find out. I went out there and met their great-grandmother, who happened to be named, oh, you'll love this name. Her name was Bathus. I thought they were shitting me, and they weren't shitting me, but they said Granny Bathus is in there. She'll talk to you now. So I went in, and I swear to God, this woman looked like she was 2,000 years old. She was nothing but skin and bones, and had shawls and quilts all around her while she sat in her rocking chair beside the kerosene heater in the old house. And it was an old, the house, of course, that was the primary part of the house, is where she lived in. The house itself had had many additions added to it over the decades. The more their family grew, the more pieces they added to the house. So the house was a bizarre mishmash of swamp architecture blended with a little bit of antebellum styling to it. A few columns here, a few columns there. Surrounded, of course, by water and everything out there in the swamp that wanted to kill you. And so Granny Bathus, looked at me and she said, "So you want to know about the Skinnerman?" I said, "Yes." And then she said, "Who did you wrong?" I said, "Nobody did me wrong." She said, "Nobody comes and asks me about the Skinnerman unless they want to make the wrong that was done to you right." I said, "No, I want to know what or who he is. And why, of course, he's the kid's boogeyman." And she told me that information, of course, came with a price. And of course, I was pulling out my wallet at that point. She told me she didn't want money, that she wanted information, which at that time I figured was harmless, but she wanted my full name written down for her. And she wanted a toenail clipping, and at the time I had hair, and she wanted a lock of my hair. She said that's all she needed of me. And she kept it in a mason, and she put everything. I gave it to her, of course. And I wrote it down with my name, full name, all my names, because she told me, "Make sure you give me all of your names. That's part of the payment." And I'll explain to why that I wish I hadn't done that later. But she put it in a mason jar, and she set it down beside her. And then she proceeded to tell me who the Skinnerman was. The tale of the Skinnerman first came over with, because, around Georgia, the Gulf, around the different ports around Georgia and Louisiana, the slave trade was huge back in the day of slavery. In the South, they were brought in there through the ports there, straight from their home in Africa. And with them, they brought their stories of the Skinnerman. It was not something they worshipped. It was something that protected them. The Skinner protected them, and they called him the Skinner. Man apparently was added to it much, much, much later on. The name Man was. So, but they used, the Skinner would protect them from harm, would be used back in their villages and their townships. The Skinner was used by individuals and families to enact revenge, plain and simple, to make the wrong things right, whether they were imagined wrongs or actual wrongs, physical harms, monetary harms, you name it. The Skinner was used to do that. And I asked, well, why was he called? Why did they call him the Skinner? And you'll have to wait for part 3 to hear that.